Professor Diego del-Castillo-Negrete is a distinguished professor in theory and modeling group of the fusion energy department at the Oak Ridge National Lab in USA. He holds a PhD in physics from University of Texas at Austin in 1994. Before joining Oak Ridge in 2000, he worked in the theoretical division of Los Alamos National Lab, 1998 to 2000, and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego, from 1994 to 1998. His research interests span a wide spectrum of topics in plasma physics, applied mathematics, nonlinear dynamics, computational physics, and machine learning. We are very happy to host you here today. Please begin your talk.
Well, thank you very much, Pavan, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the Institute for the invitation, and all of you present here for taking time to listen to this presentation. It was really a pleasant surprise for me to receive this invitation, because as some of the people that I have already presented talks in this very interesting series, I started working on fractional diffusion and fractional calculus a long time ago, as many of our colleagues. And then, so what I'm going to present this time is a little bit of a review, but also I'm going to share with you some more recent material that hopefully you will find of your interest. So let me go to the outline of the talk. So in the first part, I'm going to present some general ideas that most likely most of you already know, but I want just to set up the stage for what is next. And then in part two, I'm going to describe our work on the application of fractional diffusion model to study transport in plasmas, because that was one of my specialties. Then on part three, I'm going to enter to something that probably you have already known, but this is something that we proposed several years ago. And I think it's a topic that deserves a continuous interest, which is the issue of tempered fractional diffusion. Then I'm going to touch upon something that might not be directly connected to plasma physics, but hopefully will be of your interest, which is the role of fractional diffusion in front propagation. And I will conclude the presentation with very recent topics on the exit time problem for fractional diffusion problems. So again, starting with something which is fairly known, but let me just, it's always good to start a presentation on the same page. The study of transport, the cornerstone of transport is the conservation law of whatever quantity you are considering. In this case, the quantity is phi. Could be the temperature of the ocean, the temperature of a plasma, an animal species in a biological problem, etc. So that is a conservation law, and simply says that the rate of change of that quantity responds to the fluxes and the sources. Now, this equation is to be closed, and this is what is called the closure problem. And the standard way of doing that is to the Fourier Fifth prescription that assumes a local closure, that the flux is proportional to the gradients. And when you do that, you actually get what we know as the well-known advection-diffusion model that is extensively used and been very successful in many instances. But as many of you in this audience are aware, it has limitations. And what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is actually to see when and how this paradigm might break down, and what are the alternatives and consequences of that. So a lot of things that I'm doing, and actually my enter to the fractional world, it came from stochastic processes. So in that sense, it's always good to remind ourselves of what is the connection between the diffusion equation and stochastic processes. And this is actually something that goes back to Einstein's a remarkable paper on the Brownian motion. And what he envisioned is to say, well, in reality, the diffusion equation is a mean field theory of an underlying Brownian motion. So he actually, in the simplest setting, consider what is called a random walk, which is in this black line that you see in my slide, with this red dot moving to the left or to the right. And at each time, the displacement called Zn is a jump of at any time. And then you have a distribution function of the jumps. And then you talk about, since this is a stochastic process, you have to describe this in a probabilistic setting. And then you describe what is called a characteristic transport square, which is the variance of the jumps. Then you write the master's equation, which is a universal equation. It's just a conservation law. That's cannot be changed. I mean, this is an untouchable law. But what happens after is the part that can be a little bit questionable, because what you do is what is the so-called localization assumption that allows to do a Taylor expansion of the master equation and conveniently truncate the expansion to second order to get an advection-diffusion equation. But that rests on a very critical assumption that lambda, the Jones distribution, is very highly localized around zero, right? Which is the case in what we call local processes. So now what I'm going to discuss now is a series of instances to actually try to start a little bit deeper. What is this? What is the thing that is underlying the diffusion equation? So on one end is this local flux gradient relation, and the people use it so much that people outside our community believe that it's almost a lot, but we know this is an approximation. Because in reality, the mathematical correct expression of the flux is what you see in my slide, which is just the integral of the rate of change of the integral of the total concentration. This is the actual flux. And what Fix of Fourier did is an approximation of that. There is a very nice way that you can actually check for that. And it is that if you say you make as at a given time as a function of x, your scalar field phi is on the left side of my slide. And then you can actually say, well, as this process evolves, I can actually, in each one of these red points, record the gradient and see what flux corresponds to the gradient. So in the case that chi is constant, that should give you a straight line. So this is a nice diagnostics that if you have any problem in which you have the flux and also you have the gradient, you can just produce this plot and see if a Fix or Fourier law holds. And this is actually an actual practical diagnostics that people have used and more than us to actually, in a phenomenological way, detect when Fick's law might break down. And of course, everybody in this community, and this is the beauty of this fractional world, you pick different topics from your different areas. And as you know, one of my area of specialties is magnetically confined plasmas. And I eventually will have time to tell you a little bit about what a plasma is. But for the time being, what is very important for this slide at least is the presence of a magnetic field. And a plasma, as probably you know, is just an ionized gas. So what happens when you have an ionized gas in the presence of a magnetic field is that the particles tend to kind of move much faster along the field lines that are perpendicular to them, okay? So in reality, this is actually a very complex transport problem that we actually solve, and you can check the reference there. But what I want you to draw your attention is what is on the right-hand side, which is this diagnostic, right? So we solved this problem numerically. It's a very complicated, computationally speaking problem. But at the end of the day, we were able to compute the gradients and the fluxes. And you see very clearly that the flux-gradient relation is not a straight line. Actually, it forms these loops, which is a signature of non-locality. I believe, at least for physicists or applied scientists, it's important to actually have real evidence of these types of phenomena, because otherwise we might feel trapped in doing some interesting mathematics, but not very connected to a complete physics problem. Let me actually point out another signature of fractional and local transport that has to do with the similarity of the distribution of a given stochastic process. And this is important because when we do turbulence, we know that everything is stochastic, and then we need to resort to statistical descriptions. And one of the most interesting issues is the possibility of having self-similar distributions, right? The search for self-similarity permeates all the story of physics and turbulence in particular. So what happens when you have a local transport problem is that self-similarity tends to be very trivial. In fact, the scaling law is what you see in my first bullet with exponent gamma equal to 1. That is normal regular scaling. And typically you have Gaussian distributions. And again, diffusion processes imply this type of scaling. So this actually gives you another way of checking the validity or the existence of a diffusive process just by looking for self-similarity. There is no guarantee that a probabilistic story will be self-similar, first of all, but if it is self-similar and the self-similarity involves what is called an anomalous exponent or a non-Gaussian distribution, then you have a hint that the diffusion model will fail. And this is exactly what we found out in this sequence of papers in which we study problems in fluid mechanics and in plasma physics, solved numerically, but also some of them connected with experiments. And then what we observe is that the probability distribution of the traces in this case actually exhibit a similarity, but with an anomalous exponent, which was 4/3. And also the distribution was strongly non-Gaussian. Now, so another thing that is actually another signature of departures from diffusion processes is the scaling of the second moment. And this actually has significant implications for practical purposes because, for example, in the case of magnetically confined fusion plasmas, you care about confinement time. And if you study pollutants in the ocean or in the atmosphere, you care about how long it takes for a pollutant to spread in the atmosphere, for example. So what you want to have is a scaling law that tells you, well, what is the relation between the distance traveled by this pollutant and the time it took to do that? And diffusive scaling says that the square of the distance is linear, is proportional with time, or the distance goes by the square root of time. And that scaling law is very powerful because based on that, you can predict a lot of practical things. Now, this actually can break down, and this is something that has been observed in this beautiful experiment. It has many years. It was done many, many years, but it's still one of my references to one of the early experiments that done by Harry Sweeney, the Center for Nonlinear Dynamics at Austin, that actually show that in this vortex problem, the variance grows faster. It's not like it's the square root. It's not that like it's the square root of 2. It's a higher power than the square root of 2, and this is gamma is 1.57. So again, if you have a problem and you can track the second moment and you see growing like that, again, you have a hint that this is happening. So now let's try to actually move a little bit closer to say, well, once this ideas fails, then what can we do? And for that, I'm going to bring you back to Einstein's the Brownian motion theory, where you actually see, once again, this localization hypothesis that allows you to go from the general absolutely true master equation to a particularly potentially not correct diffusion equation that has to do with this Taylor expansion, assuming that lambda is very localized. That actually was the entry point to a lot of people trying to study fractional calculus and non-local transport in general, because they say, well, could it be the case that this transition probability has its long range that actually invalidates the Taylor expansion? And the reality is yes. And again, there are many observations or realization of this long tail phenomena. But once again, I draw your attention to this very nice experiment in which we actually observe that the particles in these vortices tend to actually escape the vortices and describe what is called a flight event, or sometimes a Levy flight event, and you can also get trapped into eddies. And if you do the statistics of that, you realize that this statistics actually power laws, are similar algebraic scaling that actually invalidates everything that Einstein did to get to the diffusion equation. And that is still all this area of the continuous time random walk that I actually don't have enough time to make justice to the countless scientists that before me actually paved the way of this wonderful branch of applied mathematics and statistical physics. So what I'm going to show you here again is that now we're going to try following this previous work, try to actually see how we can actually bypass Einstein's approach and don't assume any localization for lambda. And this is actually what is done here in a very succinct slide. I invite you to actually read the review papers and the books that have been written here if you are interested in this line of research. And the idea here is that in the approximate diffusion law, the jump probability distribution, that is the probability that the particle will be jumping, was a rapidly decaying distribution, almost a delta function. And now you see what happens if this distribution is really long range, say algebraic decay. There is also the possibility that there is some non-locality in time related to the fact that particles can actually have some so-called trapping events. At any rate, when you actually do this in a more careful way, what you realize is that the flux doesn't actually take you to Fick's law. It takes you to this expression that involves these integrodifferential operators. that, of course, all of you in this audience know that if you take the Fourier transform of these operators, you get the fractional diffusion equation. So this is just a quick review of what is already known of how fractional diffusion connects to stochastic processes. And I wanted to do this because it will actually explain, set the framework to do what I'm going to do in the next parts of the talk. And of course, you can actually write this in full generality, include also non-locality in time. And then you have what is called the fully most general asymmetric, non-local in space and time, involving fractional derivatives in space and fractional derivatives in times in the Caputo sense. So now let me actually now go to the next part of my talk, that is, well, how can all this be applied to one of my areas of research, which is plasma physics? And again, plasmas actually, despite the fact that they might look a little bit weird and unexpected and strange to our life, actually form 95% of the matter in the universe. Pretty much all of astrophysics and a good fraction of space plasma physics deals with plasma physics. But there is actually something even more remarkable for plasmas that is in the area in which I've been quite interested in the last 2 decades, which is controlled nuclear fusion. And as some of you might know, nuclear fusion is the process through which we generate a tremendous amount of energy doing the opposite of fission. That is, we take light isotopes, in this case, say deuterium, tritium, and then we try to bring them closer together, and then nuclear reactions yield to other arrangements of particles, liberating huge amounts of energy. That's exactly the process that the sun uses to produce vast amounts of energy. And a very elusive goal has been to say, well, can we actually replicate all these thermonuclear processes in the sun for peaceful uses in a controlled fashion for the net production of electricity? Well, that is exactly the problem of controlled nuclear fusion. It's extremely challenging, but probably one of the most promising approaches is to actually get this plasma where the reactions are supposed to happen and confine it with a magnetic field. The need for confinement comes from the fact that this plasma, this ionized gas of deuterium and tritium, needs to be heated at thermonuclear energies, which are millions of degrees. In fact, believe it or not, the gas needs to be heated higher than the temperature of the sun. And the reason of that is that gravity helps the sun in the nuclear fusion process, but we don't have here gravity for these machines. So we have to compensate that by increasing the temperature. And the big problem, the reason why we still are not yet until the future looks extremely promising as probably you have here in the news, is that we have the confinement problem. Heat and particles need to be trapped for a long enough time for the nuclear reactions to happen. And this is the main area of research I've been interested in. Now, you will not be surprised to hear that describing this thermonuclear plasma is extremely difficult. It's extremely nonlinear, far from equilibrium system. And in reality, the model that you need to use is a so-called Boltzmann equation coupled to Maxwell's equations, plus all the intricacies of the geometry, the walls, the external heating systems, etc. Because of that, people actually, our research community tends to develop what is called reduced models. And a family of reduced models are what is called fluid models, in which a plasma, a little bit abusing the reality of what a plasma is approximated as a fluid. And believe it, but in reality, is these so-called fluid approximations, and probably you might hear about the magnetohydrodynamic approximation, are extremely valuable once you keep them in the range of validity. The reason why I show this equation is that last week we heard a wonderful talk about the use of non-locality and fractional diffusion in Navier-Stokes and three-dimensional flux. And what I want to bring your attention is that we do have also fluid descriptions in plasmas, but not to brag, but the reality is that they are much more sophisticated and complex because a plasma is much more complicated than a neutral fluid. So this is actually a relatively complex model, which actually provides meaningful information of what happened to the plasma. So now you remember that what I was showing to you is this toroidal chamber, which is called a tokamak, which is an acronym for the Russian word, the toroidal confinement chamber. And what you see on the left is a cartoon of that. And all these numerical simulations of plasmas actually have as a domain this toroidal domain. So when we saw this three-dimensional fluid model, we observed that actually it's extremely far from equilibrium a nonlinear system, as I was mentioning. And in reality, it's not this type of boring three-dimensional isotropic model of type turbulence. It's actually a turbulence that is almost alive. It has very intriguing properties. And I'm sharing with you two of them. On the left plot, you see that this turbulence generates eddies. These eddies are similar to the eddies that you see, for example, in planets, like the Jupiter is the best example of that. And that is actually caused by the magnetic field. So these already introduces very strong correlations in the turbulence dynamics of a plasma that, as we will see, reflects dramatically in how transport happens in these systems and actually invalidates the local description. The other thing that you observe is that this is a very dynamic phenomenon exhibiting very strong relaxation phenomena. People like to call that avalanche-like phenomena because there is indeed a connection between the self-organized criticality that you see in sand piles and actually the way these plasma tend to relax, right? Okay, so now if you take these two elements, among others, which is these eddies that exist in the turbulent system, plus this breathing or avalanche-like event, and then you say, well, what will happen to a plasma particle in this type of turbulence? What you observe is that it has two elements. First of all, it exhibits trapping. There is, for some reason, some particles like to be trapped and they want to stay in the torus. But then others sense this avalanche-like phenomena and suddenly they escape. So with these two ingredients, you may actually say, well, this starts to look similar to the fluid dynamics experiment I showed before. And indeed it does. And for this system, we actually apply all this continuous time random walk picture and try to see if fractional diffusion could describe the system. And of course, describing this work will be a whole talk, but I invite you to actually check the reference if you're interested, because this was actually one of the earliest success stories of why fractional diffusion can actually be applied to a turbulence problem of interest of practical application. I'm going to go quick through this slide, okay? But what you see is the following. The red triangles show the results of a turbulence simulation. So as we saw in last week's talk, we actually also follow a direct numerical simulation and actually were able to see, well, what is the probability of the distribution of traces in this system. So in some sense, the red dots and the squares actually tell you what the numerical data gives you. And you can actually see that if you were to fit these red triangles, you don't get a Gaussian distribution because this is a logarithmic plot in the y-axis and linear in the x. It should give you a parabola. Okay. Now the other thing we observe numerically is that the variance of these traces actually exhibit anomalous diffusion. Actually, is not one. So what we realize is that if we deployed or actually wrote a fractional diffusion model which was fractional in time, with a fractional derivative of 1/2 and fractional in a space with a fractional exponent of 3/4, we were able to actually fit very well the numerical data as well as the scaling of the moment, okay? So this is, in my opinion, one of the earliest applications of fractional calculus to fluid plasma turbulence. So then motivated by that, we did something a little bit more ambitious that is actually something that I don't know how many of you that are interested in fractional diffusion in practical problems have faced. A lot of very interesting and powerful mathematics in fractional calculus happen in infinite domains, because this is where everything, all the singularities are pushed away, and then you can deploy all the power of Fourier transforms and all that. So the world of infinite domain for fractional calculus, or in general non-local transport, is pristine and is mathematically very solid. The problem is that for those of us that work in practical applications, we need to actually get these models in finite domains, right? Because in this case, is the tokamak is this fusion device, but in your case could be the ocean or could be just a simple experiment or a cavity flow, whatever. So we need to actually deal with the problem of the boundaries. And interesting enough, we actually approached this problem many years ago, and actually to some level of success, we actually were able to do that. And the reason I bring this attention is that this has been a renaissance of this problem of how to actually deal with the boundary problems of fractional diffusion in particular and non-local transport in general. And I invite you to actually let me know your progress in this area, because it is something that is remarkably important. I will not have time to actually dwell a lot into that, because once we develop this finite domain fractional model, we were able to actually tackle a lot of interesting problems for the plasmas. And let me just actually show you one that is actually important that connects with the scaling laws that I was mentioned to you. Let's say that you would like to then build this fusion device, and then you care about diffusion, right? You don't want the heat to actually reach the walls because then it will melt the walls or stop the reaction. So therefore, you need to actually say, well, the time it takes for heat to diffuse off the wall to the wall should be much longer than the operation time when I actually turn on the reactor, right? Now, it's obvious that the bigger the reactor, the longer it takes to the heat to reach the wall. So a trivial way to actually make a better reactor is to make a bigger reactor, okay? And this is what is the role of this L. L will be the size of your device. And this is something obvious. The bigger the room is, the longer it's going to take to some contaminant to reach the window, right? Okay. So now, the quick question is, well, if I double the size of my machine, will the time double or quadruple? And the answer is that if the process is diffusive, the time will quadruple, okay? So that's with news. If I go from 1 meter to 2 meters, suddenly everything gets multiplied by 4 and I am way more efficient. The reality is that there is anomalous scaling, and in reality, the scaling happens to the power of alpha, where alpha could actually be less than 2. So we actually run this fractional diffusion model to actually communicate the fact that if fractional diffusion operates in these fusion machines, the scaling laws that you need to use to design the machines are going to be much less favorable, okay? Anyhow, I wish I could continue to this describing this area, but I don't want to overwhelm you because some of you might not care too much about plasma physics. But let me actually now go to the third section and talk about something a little bit more connected to the mathematics of fractional diffusion, and also the physics of fractional diffusion. And that has to do with Temper-Levy processes. And you know, I was telling you about the idea of Levy flights and also the divergence of the second moments that actually connects a little bit with this strongly singular character of the fractional diffusion operators. And the motivation of that, as I was mentioning, is that typically people care that anomalous transport processes involve a stochastic process with very large jumps, right? But then the reality is that mathematically, you can actually push the mathematics, assuming that actually the second moment is infinite and jumps can happen in an infinite domain. But in practical terms, remember, we are confined to live in a box, in finite size domain systems. Something similar, although different from the conceptual point of view, a little bit similar happens with the concept of fractals, right? We know that a fractal is something that is fractal all the way to infinitum, but in reality, you reach a scale in which the fractal truncates because you reach the atomic scale, right? So therefore, again, if you care about practical processes, you need to actually incorporate a way to say, well, what will happen if fractional diffusion kind of faces a wall, or the Levy flights face a wall? And this is actually what we did, because if you have a process, a transport process in which the second moment is finite, you know that the Gaussian law, the Brownian motion will take to the diffusion equation. If the second moment is infinite, like in a Levy process, you will actually get the fractional equation. So the question we asked back then is that, well, if the algebraic scaling is truncated by this type of Yukawa type of shielding effect that actually stop the long jumps after some scale, what model would you get? And actually, that brought us back to the basics of the random walk. And actually, this is a little bit of a review. And don't have time to actually go through the detail. And I invite you to actually look to this reference. What we realize here is the following. We say, well, look, the fractional derivatives live or are consequences or assuming that underlying the stochastic process is a Levy alpha stable process. But in reality, the stochastic processes are more general than alpha stable processes. And that was actually discovered by Levy and Kinchin, that actually wrote this wonderful formula to actually generate all the, what is called the infinite divisible processes, which are the ones that we would like to use for practical applications. And as you can say, they actually have a function, which is like a free function called the Levy density. So now it is that Levy density that can be chosen differently. And so what we did back then, say, well, what equation would you get if we just keep the problem as general as possible? And this is actually the non-local equation that we got. Now, as a sanity check, you could actually say, well, how do I get my below fractional equation? Well, if your Levy density is this very violent algebraic decaying distribution, sure, you'll get your well-known fractional diffusion equation. The most interesting part of our work was to say, well, what would happen if we actually have this damping effect of this cutoff effect on the alpha stable distributions on the Levy flies? And what you get there is an equation that actually looks like the fractional equation, but the fractional operator has been changed. And that actually has to do with something back then we call it the tempered fractional derivative, which is like the fractional derivative, the Riemann-Liouville fractional derivative put sandwiched between exponential factors. So what we did back then is say, well, this is actually an interesting model. Let's try to see what are the consequences of that. So mathematically, you could have a lot of beautiful ideas about that, but physically it has a very profound effect, which is the following. Once you have tempering effect, everything is going to be transitory in the sense there's going to be like intermediate asymptotic, where you will see all the phenomenology of fractional diffusion, but asymptotically, you will be drawn towards non-fractional or regular diffusion processes. And for example, if you think of a problem that has memory, then you will have, if I have memory, say beta different from 1, and I have also a fractional diffusion alpha less than 2, then you will see what is called the anomalous scaling, right, that you see in the first half. But then eventually, as time goes on, the alpha that was your fractional diffusion exponent transition to a regular diffusion. So what this tells you is that now all the problems that you will be doing in fractional calculus, in reality, if you have this truncation effect that is expected to be present in all the physical application, will be such that truly asymptotically, you will land into the regular diffusion process. Now, that doesn't mean that you will actually need to forget about non-locality of fractional diffusion, because it depends on the time scale you are interested. Like, for example, this is an example that we work out in the sense that at short times that actually, or intermediate times that might actually be the ones you are interested in your experiment, your distributions exhibit these power law Levy distributions that are very well described by the just pure fractional diffusion problem. But if you wait very long times, okay, maybe those times are outside the range of applicability or interest in your application, but maybe those time scales are actually within your area of interest, then trust me, you will actually be back into the Gaussian diffusion world. So, and with that, we actually study a lot of very interesting problems. So, well, how this tempered diffusion will actually manifest in problems of practical interest. And of course, we went back to all these transport problems in plasma physics and in fluid dynamics and to see that effect. But what I want to do now is to actually jump to a fourth topic. And that fourth topic has to do with something different to what I've been talking so far, although, believe it or not, actually motivated by transporting plasmas, that has to do with the story of front propagation. And I'm going to actually go back to this tempered fractional diffusion, because first I wanted to tell you some ideas on the role of fractional diffusion in front propagation, and then I'm going to show you some slides on how tempered diffusion manifests into that. So now, what should we care about from propagation? Is that fronts, forget about the mathematics, actually are present in a lot of interesting problems in physics, biology, chemical engineering. The paradigmatic examples is how a flame propagates, but also how biological systems behave. And one of the best known systems is actually this Fisher-Kolmogorov, and it should be actually include Budbinski, because I now forget the exact spelling of this former Russian that actually came with this model also. So this model belongs to a class of reaction diffusion systems that couple nonlinearities with diffusion processes, and based on that, they can generate from front propagation to very fascinating Turing patterns and stuff like that, right? So at least for this problem, one of the things that people have studied is to actually the fronts, and then a front is something that you have a binary state or a system. The state can be in a 0 state or a 1 state. Say 0 is that the flame has not burned the wood, and one is that the flame has actually burned the material you're interested in. And the idea is as time goes on, the flame propagates, or the chemical or the species propagate, which in this case means that the blue line that describes the front goes to the right. And typically, these fronts have moved at a constant speed. And that speed has a very simple, beautiful formula. And a lot of things has been done in there. So then what we tried to do back then, say, well, what will happen if actually we have fractional diffusion? And the reason why I am actually mention this to you is that since this early work that we did, there's been a lot of work, people interested in coupling fractional calculus to reaction diffusion systems. And I hope that some of the people of the audience or maybe of the future speakers will actually take this topic, because I think it has tremendous applications in biology, sociology, and a lot of a population dynamics that involves non-local transport, right? Okay. Again, I'm just going to glimpse you through the results some of the main results that we had. And so what you see on the left is the standard Fisher-Kolmogorov equation, except that instead of the Laplacian, I have this fractional derivative. And for illustration purposes, you know that the fractional derivative, you have the left and the right fractional derivative. The results I'm presenting here actually relate to if you only have the left fractional derivative, that actually tells you that all the non-locality is going to be to one side of the front, okay? So then what happens is actually remarkably interesting, because the usual fronts propagates at a constant speed. And this is a speed, this is what I call the Kolmogorov-Fisher speed. The important thing is that the fronts just march linearly, like ridges at a constant velocity. What happens when you have fractional diffusion is that in reality, the fronts accelerates. But not only they accelerate exponentially fast. And then if you look at the space-time plot, you see this color picture in which you see first like sort of a straight line dividing the stable phase, that is the phase that is burning, to the unstable phase, the blue region. And then everything seems to be marching linearly. Remember, time is in the vertical, but then you hit this knee and then the system accelerates exponentially fast. The other thing that happens is that the standard fronts kind of decay very fast. They actually are fronts, right? They just have like 1 on the left and 0 on the right, and you have a tiny boundary layer describing the transition. When you have fractional diffusion, this actually doesn't happen. In reality, the fronts expand algebraically in a very violent fashion. So again, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, or people that have actually worked more on this, because this is something that I've been also very, very interested in. But let's actually close this section, bringing back this issue of the truncating fronts, because this is actually even more interesting, because you say, okay, Diego, so I believe you that, let's say that you have a biological population spreading problem, and then people use the standard Fisher-Kolmogorov. Let me see the chat. Oh, okay. I was just looking at the chat. I was not missing anything. Okay, so then the idea now here is the following, right? We know that this species will actually, or this flame that is propagating will move at a constant speed. When you have fractional diffusion, you actually have exponential acceleration. But we know that exponential acceleration needs to stop, because otherwise the species will actually go faster than the speed of light. It will not make any sense. And this is an example that actually, well, what would happen if instead of the usual Riemann-Liouville derivative, you put this tempered fractional derivative I proposed back then? Then you have to deal with this blue equation, and we studied that in in a lot of numerical and analytical detail. But what I want to bring to your attention is the actual results. And the actual results are actually very, very interesting. Okay, first, I want to remind you what happens when you have no truncation. Now, this is panel A. This is a plot that actually, this is actually in a logarithmic scale, in a log scale. And this is a pure fractional front. And what you see there is that the red line is the standard diffusion front. And you see in the blue line is that the front actually has these huge algebraic decaying tails, okay? Now, as lambda, that is this truncation increases, takes you to panel B, C, and then if you look at panel D, you need to look careful, because this panel B now, the X scale is actually linear. So in reality, from panel A to panel D, you go from algebraic, very slow long-term tails to very rapidly exponential tails. So what happens is that these accelerated fronts in time actually behave like the standard Fischer-Kolmogorov type fronts. And one way of doing that is that you can actually track the speed of the front. And when you actually have when you have no truncation, for example, you will see that the velocity of the front stays constant, okay, which is actually the green line. So green line will be lambda infinity. But then if you take, for example, lambda equal 50, you see that the velocity starts to actually ramp up a little bit, and then it settles into this regime of like a terminal velocity, right? So this is a very clear example of how physics needs to be incorporated to a fractional diffusion model to describe things that are hopefully physically more meaningful than the violent behavior of fractional diffusion. So I'm gonna use the rest of the time to actually move you forward to today, more or less, or to the last couple of years, in which we're being studying a problem which is very interesting and also very famous and important, which is the so-called exit time problem. And the exit time problem is very easy to formulate. And in the simplest, or one of the simplest settings is the following. Let's assume that you have a disk, right, with boundary, this blue circle, and then you have a bunch of particles that move some way inside this disk. And let's assume for the sake of simplicity that these particles actually move in a stochastic fashion, right? Think about like Brownian walkers. Now, because it's a stochastic process, some particles will reach the boundary very fast, others will take forever, and maybe others will never get the boundary, no matter how hard they walk around. So the exit problem is very simple. Well, what is the probability that at a given time, a given particle will exit the domain? Now, I think that it's very easy to find realization of where this problem should be of significant relevance, right? For example, obviously in plasma physics, in fusion plasma, that matters a lot because you say, well, what is the probability that electrons in the plasma or ions in the plasma are not going to hit the wall? Because when they hit the wall, something bad might happen. And might actually say, well, what is the probability that these particles actually exiting and hitting the wall, right? If you care about transport of pollutants in the ocean, let's say that you have an oil spill somewhere in the ocean, and you say, well, I'm going to draw a circle around the area of the spill, and I will say, what is the probability that the contaminant, this type oil, will actually cross that circle, because maybe beyond that circle there is a beach or there is a river that actually from people actually can affect their way of life, right? So very easy to think what this problem is very important. Now, of course, how the particles move inside that circle is actually part of the problem, and there are many ways that can happen, okay? But what I'm doing here is something very specific, okay? I'm restricting my attention to these so-called Fokker-Planck equations, which in reality, in the language that I've been using up to now, is pretty much just advection-diffusion equations, but with the potential presence of non-locality, okay? So again, U, in this case, is the field you are interested in. Again, could be your pollutant in the ocean, the temperature of a plasma, anything you are interested in is U. And then you have a dynamic equation, a partial differential equation for U, du dt. And then you have this L of F, which is this, what is called a forward operator. And the first time is just the advection. The second time is the diffusion. It's like the Laplacian of U, except that this is kind of the full generality allowing for three-dimensional anisotropic processes. And the next step, the next thing is this integral operator that, as you can imagine, as you can already imagine, is that you can choose gamma in some way as to actually make this thing look like a fractional derivative. And then you have G. So the question we have is the following. If we go back to the problem of this circle and assume that the particles inside these circles are described by this type of integral differential equation, how can I actually solve the exit time problem? Now, as many things, there is a dumb way to solve the problem that is kind of direct, but very dumb and very inefficient, which is what is called to run Monte Carlo simulations. You just take 1 million particles, you launch them, you integrate the orbits and see how many of them leave the domain. The problem with that is that you have two main problems. I'll share the following. First of all, this Monte Carlo simulation, you need massive amount of computations to actually make that happen. The other thing is that in reality, the only particles that you're taking into account are the ones that actually are exiting the domain. So what you do, you are computing a lot of things that are useless. The smart way of doing that is actually using what is called the adjoint problem, which is kind of the backward diffusion or Fokker-Planck equation. And probably I will not have enough time to explain you this in detail, but the idea here is the following. Remember that the quantity of interest, what we want to compute is the probability of exit time. This is what we call this P sub E. Well, it happens that P sub E can actually be obtained, but if you know P, and in this case, P is the solution of this equation that looks almost the same as this one, except that my L of F has been changed by the adjoint operator, okay? And this actually turned the problem into a terminal value problem that you can actually use in a very efficient way to actually solve this problem. Now, so what we want to do is to actually solve this equation, but in the case that gamma actually has some non-local transport processes in general and fractional diffusion in particular. Now, we could actually just write a PDE integrodifferential solver to solve the problems I described. But what we want to actually do is something different. And this is something that has been our main interest these days, which actually is to use what is called the Feynman-Kac method to actually solve this problem, okay? Now, unfortunately, I will not have time to actually explain the detail of how the Feynman-Kac method actually can be used to do this problem, right? But my only hope is to actually excite your interest to try to actually read our most recent papers and actually maybe if you're interested, communicate with me. As you know, Feynman got famous among many things by doing the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics. So in a sense, he actually devised a way to solve Schrödinger equation that doesn't need to solve the Schrödinger PDE. And then Kac, which was a mathematical probability theory expert, saw the potential of that formula in the diffusion, and they created what is called now the Feynman-Kac theory formula or theorems, right? So then what we're actually trying to do is to actually use that formalism to solve the exit problem, but not only for regular diffusion, but also for fractional diffusion. And then, again, I will not have time to actually explain the details, but let me just actually show you quickly how that will happen. Let's assume that the question describing the dynamics of the particles that govern the exit time problem is this regular advection-diffusion equation. Then what you should know, and probably you know already, is that all these diffusion or Fokker-Planck type equations are directly associated to stochastic processes. So you can actually solve this problem by solving the PDE or solve the stochastic differential equation. So now, and in fact, this actually tells you two ways of solving the problem. You can solve the problem by solving this PDE, approach number one. Approach number two is you run Monte Carlo simulations integrated these SDEs. And approach number three is what we are proposing, which is the use of the Feynman-Kac formula. And the Feynman-Kac formula is really the question that you actually see there. That is going to be difficult to actually, if you don't know already, to understand what it is, but hopefully I can transmit an overall feeling. The Feynman-Kac formula solves the adjoint equation by computing an expectation value. And the expectation value is expectation of this indicator function that actually determines when you exit the domain. And that is conditioned to the stochastic dynamics that is driving your dynamics. Okay? In reality, it's a little bit mysterious, but doing a Markovian approximation, you could actually write that the solution of this problem can actually be used recursively, right? And this is actually what is in this equation. Now, what happens when you do that is that you are considering dynamics from n to n plus 1 in a time interval of length delta t. And if delta t is short enough, any stochastic process can actually be approximated by a regular Brownian motion that actually allows to write the recursive relation by taking convolution with the Gaussian propagator. So this is actually the key of this method, that at the end of the day, to solve the exit problem for a diffusion problem, you just need to compute a bunch of Gaussian quadratures. And if you are familiar a little bit with Feynman's view of quantum mechanics, you will realize that you might remember that solving quantum mechanics with path integrals boils down to just do integrals of Gaussian propagators. So this is actually the reincarnation of this idea for this exit problem. And then we actually applied this to a fluid dynamics problem that you actually see here. This was actually like a Rayleigh-Bénard problem, which you have advection and diffusion. And then we deployed our method. And what you see in the bottom panel is actually the probability of exiting. Yellow means that you will actually have a very high probability to hitting the top or bottom boundary, and dark blue that the probability is very low. Again, this was our application, the proposed application in the case of standard local diffusion. But now, what we wanted to say is that, well, can we actually extend this to non-local problems in general and fractional diffusion in particular? And this paper was accepted late last year in the Science Journal of Numerical Analysis. You can see the details there. And again, in the top row, you actually see the adjoint equation that we're interested. And then you see this integral operator. And the key is actually that you need to actually modify very seriously the underlying stochastic processes, because this is not anymore Brownian motion. This is why I actually consider in significant detail the underlying stochastic process of fractional diffusion or local transport, right? So you learn from this introduction part of my lecture that when you go away from regular diffusion and enter the realm of fractional diffusion and non-local diffusion, then you need to give up the idea you have Brownian motions, and you have to do more richer stochastic processes. And this is why you see that this stochastic process driving the Feynman-Kac formula is much more complicated. And in the bottom, you see the mathematics of actually how this recursive process takes into consideration. So I will not have time to actually dwell into that, but again, hopefully you'll be interested to follow up in later conversations. But let me actually show you how can actually this be a story. So we study a kind of a simple problem, which is that let's assume you have a line from -4 to 4, one-dimensional domain, and then you assume that inside that line you actually have particles exhibiting fractional diffusion, okay, with a fractional exponent alpha. And then you start all your particles as initial delta functions concentrated, say, around 0, around any position between -4 and 4. And the question you have is the following. You say, well, okay, what is the probability? So then you say, well, I'm going to let these particles run by assuming that they exhibit fractional diffusion. And I want to know what is the probability that a particle in that location will exit the domain. And this is actually the answer. And the answer is in these plots are actually, if you look first at the left plot, you'll see that it has circles and lines in 3 cases that actually corresponds to very non-local, alpha equal 1.25, 1.5, and 1.75. And then you see for each case circles and straight lines. And the straight lines are the Feynman-Kac formula, and the circles are actually what you will do with the DOM direct Monte Carlo simulation. And then you see that the 2 methods agree, because you say, well, this fractional Feynman-Kac sounds a little bit funny, but it actually, you see that it works with the standard method. And then what you actually see is that when the problem is very non-local, the probability of exit increases significantly. And the left plot was at a fixed time, but on the right-hand side, you actually will see what happens as a function of time. And I'm running out of time. I'm going to conclude with this very complex example, which is to study non-local transport in general, that a fractional diffusion component in actually a 3-dimensional toroidal geometry. This is actually a way of saying, well, can we apply all these techniques to a tokamak, to a plasma that exhibits non-local possible fractional diffusion in 3 dimensions? So therefore, you need to actually deal with this very complicated equation that actually is 3-dimensional, and the coordinates are actually toroidal coordinates. So then the question is to solve this problem. And of course, you need to know what is gamma. And this is actually the specific value of the gamma, of the the details of the model. And this is actually the recursive algorithm that we use. And trust me, this actually is a problem that has fractional diffusion of alpha close to 1 in one direction. And I'm just going to conclude my presentation by showing some slides of actually you can solve this problem in this toroidal geometry, and probably conclude by just showing you my summary slide that actually, just to recap a little bit. So I went through a little bit of a review of how fractional diffusion is tied to stochastic processes, and probably many of you are experts in this area, but those of you that are not, I invite you to actually look into this perspective, because stochastic processes create a beautiful framework to actually understand what fractional diffusion is and how you can generalize. Then hopefully I convince you that plasma physics problems can actually be approached by this type of formalism, because they do exceed non-local transport. Then I brought your attention to this thing that we did some time ago, which is this tempered fractional diffusion, that in my opinion is critical for practical applications. Then I went on to the issue of front propagation, and concluded with the exit time problem and this Feynman-Kac formalism. But let me stop here and then actually let you talk and hear your feedback, and hopefully get some questions from you. Thank you very much, Pavan.
Thanks, Professor. The pleasure was mine. Regarding the questions, please raise your hand. I'll call out your name as they appear on my screen. I don't see any raised hand. I have so I'll probably take this opportunity to ask a rather trivial question. I was actually quite happy to see the work on the Levy-Kraichinen formula. Uh, uh, but it was a while ago when I read your paper. But the part I was wondering is like how do you invert the system to get the fractional operator? Do you take an inverse Fourier transform? Because I'm not familiar with that line.
No, this is actually a very interesting point, Pavan, which has to do to something that that I didn't have time to do it. In reality, if you go back to the regular diffusion equation, you actually do a Taylor expansion. Now, when you actually have more general distributions, the Taylor expansions are not feasible, because the coefficients of the expansions are the moments of the distributions, and they are infinite. So the question is, what do you do? What you do is you go to Fourier space. Now, in Fourier space, you know that you can do what is so-called the long wavelength limit. That is, you consider the k of the Fourier transform close to 0. And in reality, you can not do the Taylor expansion. You can actually recover the diffusion equation if you have a Gaussian process and you take the term k equals 0, right? In the lowest wavelength. That approach of working in Fourier space in the long wavelength limit survives the problem of the divergence of the moments. So this is the mathematically correct way to do that. So the first thing is that you start with the master's equation, then you invoke the most general Levy-Kinchin process, and that will give you an equation that in Fourier space have all the possible case. Right there, you still have something that is way too complicated. You have to take that equation in the limit when k is very small, okay? And it is then that all these complicated Fourier transform will collapse into tractable operators, okay? Which actually brings the important physics, meaning that all these models are continuous or asymptotic limits of a kinetic description, right?
Yeah.
By the way, the same happens for times in the realm of Laplace transform, right? So I don't know if that's actually answer your question, but it goes through the process of a limiting process of a long wavelength limit of the Levy-Kinchin formula.
Thank you. It does give me a direction, like how to proceed with it. And the other thing I quite enjoyed learning about your work was on the tempered part.
Yes.
because I'm also of the same viewpoint. Because all right, we don't really have infinite jumps. If we had infinite jumps, we don't need Zoom. I would be talking to you directly.
Exactly. Isn't it? Yeah, that's why we could actually fly in 1 minute. I'll be there having some espresso with you.
Yeah. So I looked at it, myself.
Yes.
But this one thing I realized that alpha and lambda were not unique for a problem. So do you also have the similar observation?
Absolutely, because this is something that we have always faced in fractional diffusion. When you have regular diffusion, the two is a two, and nobody will say, "Well, yeah, that's it." When you have an alpha or a beta in a fractional equation, nobody knows what is the alpha and the beta. They become free parameters in reality.
Mm, mm,
Some in very few cases you can actually get alpha and beta from actual physics ideas. Most of the
yeah.
time are almost fitting parameters. Now, this truncation, this new parameter lambda, is also a fitting parameter. Again, in some specific examples, which I know of a couple of them in plasma physics, the value of these parameters come from the physics. In general, fitting parameters that probably you need that based on intuitions of the problem that you are doing, right? And by the way, let me tell you that since we did this tempered fractional, there's been a lot of people working on that. And the reason why I mentioned here, of course, I didn't make justice to the work that came after our proposal because it's been significant, is that they didn't have time to do it, obviously. And then, but my hope is that people actually interested in fractional calculus looks back to that problem, right? The problem of the truncation and the problem of the finite domains. In my opinion, anybody interested, and I don't claim to have the correct way of the final word of how to deal with these problems, but we need to actually focus on these problems if we care about applications.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I'm of a similar opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Uh,
you, Pavan.
Let me check once more with the audience if there are any more questions, or anybody has a final remark or something. You may uh, open your mic and say it. I guess no. Professor Diego, do you have any final remarks?
Yes, my final remarks is to thank you, Pavan,
Yeah.
the Institute, the audience, for being so kind and open and patience because you have to deal with all the logistics. Thank you very much, and please stay in touch. Okay, I will try to the extent of my possibility to continue seeing the series. Okay, but please stay in touch. And once again, thank you very much for a wonderful activity.
Thank you. The pleasure has been mine, and many of the speakers who have generously agreed to join this seminar series. So thank you everyone for joining. Especially thank Professor Diego for this nice talk. We close the session here today.